Welcome again to Psychology to Live By. Today's another Q&A, today with some very kind people. The podcast to be discussed is the second of 4 in the Selfless series, and it's subtitled Building Compassion. Our participants have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. And I'll do a quick summary of that part 2 now before we go into our Q&A. In part 1, we saw that being compassionate doesn't fatigue us, but in fact rejuvenates us, even when we're feeling low. In this second episode, we'll explore a number of ways we can build this capacity for compassion. But first, why might we not feel inclined to be more compassionate? And then what can we do about that? Well, perhaps a major reason is that although we are hardwired for compassion, we're also deeply hardwired for self-interest. And it may appear as yet another thing to add to my long list of what I have to do. Perhaps also the claims about compassion strike me as too touchy-feely to be true. Or is trying to be compassionate, is that just plain inauthentic? Shouldn't it just come naturally? Well, whatever the complex of reasons, one thing has been clearly demonstrated, that we can build our capacity for compassion. For example, it's been shown that after practicing loving kindness meditation, for example, people are not only better able to perceive and feel the suffering of others, but they are also better able to cultivate positive emotions, which then serve as a buffer against empathic distress. Indeed, brain scans of expert practitioners of loving-kindness meditation show that compassion circuits and pathways in their brains become highly elaborated and available on demand almost instantly. All of this points to the power of deliberate practice. Using neuroplasticity, or the changeable nature of our brain, no matter who we are, we can become more and more compassionate. This then becomes a matter of intentionality, remembering to take as many opportunities as possible in daily life to wire it in. So some other less formal ways to build compassion just include things like being altruistic or taking pro-social action. Or we can recall or even write down memories of people we have warm and compassionate feelings for. We can also experience what Buddhists call sympathetic joy, as we recall our pleasure at their pleasure. An exercise I often give to people is for them to try to give each person they meet what I call the 3 experiences. The experiences of being heard, understood, and accepted. This kind of generous listening is enabled in us, the listener, by compassion. And we can do this if we really desire the well-being of the other person. And finally, just a word of encouragement. Developing the capacity for compassion is gradual. It's an emergent quality, and it's characterised by a growing wisdom that enables us to cultivate more and more win-wins in everyday life. And this is about gradually becoming more selfless, more egoless, in favour of more openness. All right, so let's go to our Q&A, and here are my kindly friends, and I'll let you, whoever wants to start first, jump in. But as always, I'm very interested in your reflections on this podcast. Who would like to kick it off?
I can start.
Thanks, Colleen.
I think that, like anything that's important, the way you described, you can build capacity for it. You can, if you work on it, you will improve.
Yeah.
So I think that resonated.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Again, it's not that there's more than one factor at play here.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I mean, certainly some people, I think, are born constitutionally, in terms of personality and maybe their home environment as well, where they get a head start. It might be easier for them to be compassionate. But and conversely, some people might be more lower on agreeableness and maybe have less. They're very, very stable emotionally. They don't have a lot of emotional range, and they may not be as open to experience. So we might get, for some people, they're starting from a lower base, if I put it that way. But for all people, there's no doubt, and I think I made reference to those brain scans of experienced loving kindness practitioners. Apparently, I haven't. I've seen the brain scans. I don't know whether I'm qualified to diagnose them, but what I've read is that there are remarkable differences in their brain structures subsequent to years of this practice. I mean, it's apparently it's very, very, very obvious. And I remember reading one example. I think it was of Mathieu Ricard, who is the Dalai Lama's right-hand man, and they were kind of shocked because the kind of activations in the sort of areas that have been associated with compassion, they're well known. The level and degree of activation was quite pronounced, like remarkable. But the thing that really amazed them was that you could go from a normal state to sort of 100% almost instantly. And so it gives us, I think it gives us hope. It's motivating to know that when we practice things like compassion, we get better and better and better at it. The other piece here is that I mentioned neuroplasticity, and just to be clear, what neuroplasticity is about, the things that we practice tend to get wired in, and it outcompetes. An image I've once read is that the brain is like competitive real estate, and so if you practice in a lot of kindness, it's going to outcompete, as it were, unkindness. And we become what we do. We sculpt ourselves over time, and that's what we ought to do. Just on another tangent, I often distinguish between personality and character. And as you know, when I talk about personality, I tend to emphasize its innate qualities, its genetic inheritance. And but very often when people talk about character, they conflate it with personality. And I think that's wrong, because personality, as is a common expression, character, sorry, there's a common expression, it was character building, some experience. And so I think, developing our capacity for compassion is a very important dimension of character development. Yeah, fantastic. I'm like you, Colleen. I really love the fact that we can make ourselves more compassionate people. All right, Chris or Terry?
Yeah, I'll go next. Unless, Chris, you want to go next?
Go for it.
Okay. So I was really struck by the sympathetic joy, having been honored enough to be around a number of Buddhist monks, and seeing at the beginning of a kirtan to the end of the kirtan, the path of the hundreds of people within inside that event moving to this point of the Hare Krishnas are going nuts, right? Type of thing.
So Terry, you might need to explain for the listener what a kirtan is.
So a kirtan is when you sing a bunch of chants. It's call and response. So who's ever up on the stage might say a chant, and then you kind of sing back. And a kirtan can be used for anything. It could be at an ABBA concert, or it could be at a concert that Chris and I were at Monday where like the band asks the audience to sing in certain parts of the song. That creates that moment of everything else goes, everyone's involved, and you get this empathy joy because you're all
sympathetic joy.
Yeah, and it's just wow to watch, and that's an example of it. In just why do people go to live concerts? It's for moments like that.
Yeah, beautiful. I've just recalled to in our previous podcast, I think I called it empathetic joy, but in fact it's sympathetic joy. But so again, this is a very natural part of our makeup. And we actually yearn for it, and I know exactly what you're talking about in the context of live concerts, for example. But the same sort of thing, can happen amongst sports fans, if their team is winning, and that sort of group feeling of oneness, of collectively being a part of something larger in particular. We seem to yearn for that, and, we relax. And I think it's interesting when you look at the accounts of people who may be, quite advanced in their spiritual development. I'm thinking in particular in meditative advancement. They often talk about a spontaneous joy in which they feel very, very connected to everything and everyone around them. And so I think sympathetic joy is just the human to human component of that. And I do think we have a kind of natural inclination to that. We have a desire to move towards it, even if we don't realize it, as a kind of spiritual yearning. I think that's actually what it is. The other thing to say about sympathetic joy is just how damn good it is for you. It's it's just the best. And by contrast, when someone is jealous of someone else, and when another person has some success, the person who is jealous of them, and has envy, there's no worse suffering. It's a truly horrible experience, and there's something obvious here about, if we want to be happy, we ought to pay attention to the things that make us happy, right? But I think I've said in an earlier podcast, it's a sad observation about human beings that, generally speaking, people would rather be right than happy. And that's what sits behind envy and jealousy and so on, this inability to feel, to share in the joy of someone else's joy. I think Professor Carol Dweck also talks about this when she talks about fixed mindsets. A feature of a person with a fixed mindset, that is the person who feels like their capacities have an absolute, they're kind of permanent and they're set. They're not subject to neuroplasticity, for example, as we were discussing earlier. One of the features of a person with a fixed mindset is that they're threatened by other people's success because it has implications for their ability, right? So again, we want to have a more growth-oriented, more open orientation to the world, and then we can celebrate other people's success. Yeah, that's fantastic. I hadn't thought about it in the context of what's that term you used again? The
kirtan.
The kirtan, yeah. Because I had.
It's that call and response, right? And
yeah.
It's that. I mean, obviously, the monks look at it differently, but it's essentially the same rawness. So
Yes.
it just, and then of course that, going to a rock concert, and the highlight is that call and response.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because people are now equal participants.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
Even my wife turned to me and said, "It's nice to hear you sing again." Like, oh.
Beautiful.
Chris was also there too, so he can like talk about that, about those moments.
Well, now that I heard that you were singing along, I wish I had been closer to you. I would have liked to have heard you singing too.
Not so sure. I think that was for an audience of one.
Yeah, a biased audience member. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the three experiences is something that kind of really caught me. Being heard, making sure people feel heard, feel understood, feel accepted in the interactions that you have with them. And it reminded me to a conversation that we've had on a previous podcast as well about it's impossible for any of us to be uninfluencing observers in any social dynamic.
Yeah.
Right? What the energy that we bring into any interaction and any group situation is going to influence the outcome of that group situation by maybe a small amount or maybe a large amount, but we can't just expect that the things are going to happen without our influence, right? And in the same way, everybody else is influencing that dynamic and the way things interact. And so by being, this is more of a comment, I guess, than a question, but by being cognizant of the ways that we are presenting ourselves and receptive to others in the way that they're interacting with us will also influence the way that they interact with us.
Yeah, totally. And yes, I remember that. I think I said you cannot not influence people, and so if we're not cognizant of the impact we're having on people, we'll tend to think that the way they're now acting is entirely their nature.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the case. I had an experience recently, for example, where I consult to a company. I have done for years. I've got a very close relationship with the head of HR. But I was talking to this other person who I really respect and really like, and he's had an almost entirely opposite experience of this person. And he went into quite some detail about why he has that view, and I think he's right. But I also think I'm right. And so how do we unstitch that little puzzle? And I think it's because people are complex. They have what I call a repertoire of ways of being, within the constraints of their personality and so on. So I think my experience of this person is very different to his because we're very different people towards that person and we're eliciting very different things from that person. And so this is where being compassionate, and you mentioned the three experiences, this is where we appeal to the better angels of people's nature.
Right.
And
present their best self.
Correct. And that's more of a challenge with some people than others. Right? Because, they might be damaged goods in some sense. They might find it harder to be nice, harder to be agreeable, but still, it's the rare person who is just, an absolute psychopath or, an absolutely malignant narcissist. So for the vast majority of people, I think we've got a lot of room to move. And even if it's just self-interest, Chris, wouldn't we want to have convivial relations with people, more or less all the time if we can elicit that from people? And obviously, we're going to have our favourites, people who we just can relax with and so on. But the rest of the time, I would argue it's more than worth the effort to give those just to talk about those three experiences, to be heard, understood, and accepted. Most of us, I was just going to say, most of us are pretty good with the first one, but actually I paused on that because, you know, in the digital age, sometimes, you know, people aren't even very good at basically hearing other people, you know, because they might be actually looking at their phone, for example, or texting. But, you know, most people can get that. You know, I've heard you. And if they've listened well enough, they might even intellectually understand a person. The third one is a much higher bar. You know, for example, how do we affirm someone? You know, how do we accept them as they are when we disagree with them? When they hold views that we find abhorrent, right? And, you know, again, this is where our empathy is going to try to pull us away. You know, it's going to move us towards antipathy. And, you know, I think this is where compassion comes in. This is where we identify with them as another human being, where we recognise the limits of human nature, where we appeal to the better angels of their nature. No, it's not going to always work, of course. But the other important aspect to this, Chris, is that we're determining how we're being. And, you know, the fact that someone else is like they are doesn't have to pull us into a state, because, you know, they're influencing us as well. You know, we mentioned you can't not influence, so they're the same. And so this is where we want to take control of how we're going to be in the world, you know, as much as we can. And I think by practicing compassion, and, you know, it's good for us. If it's not reciprocated, that's just the way it is. And so it's, you know, it's a simple injunction given people three experiences, but the practice of it, you know, takes a lot of practice over and over and over and over and over and over. And, you know, until it starts to transform us through the neuroplasticity, we then become people who do listen with compassion. We become people who become more objective about other people's, you know, even malevolence. Ironically, I think it actually puts us in a better position to take better action to counteract bad action. Right? It's not about a passivity, and I don't think that's the difference between affirming someone and agreeing with them. We don't have to agree to affirm, and we're more likely to get somewhere in dialogue with them if they feel affirmed. Yeah. Fantastic, guys. I think that's the three of us, isn't it? We're done. Well, again, you know, you guys take me to places that step right outside, but then, you know, but it's related, isn't it? I mean, obviously these things are like a complex web of interrelations. And speaking of which,
it's everyday life. It's everyday
correct.
Life.
Yeah, it is everyday life. And, you know, topics like this, of course, are all about human nature and what we do every day. And obviously that's the theme of, you know, psychology to live by. It's like, how do we apply this in practical ways every day? So what we're going to do when we meet next for our next Q&A is we'll go to part 3 and 4. We'll talk about now self-compassion, you know, why it's important in part 3, and then in part 4, how do we build self-compassion? And I expect more curly questions.
I think we're just going for the self-compassion part probably right after this call, actually.
I think he might.
Off to the spa.
Exactly. All right, guys. As always, it's wonderful. It's a great pleasure, and I look forward to our next Q&A.
Thank you.
See you guys.